Step back into a time where the air smelled of wood smoke and iron, and frequently the copper tang of blood. In the Middle Ages, justice wasn't a blindfolded lady with scales. It was a hungry beast, fed by the ingenuity of the cruel. They didn't just want you dead. They wanted you to be a masterpiece of agony, a living, breathing warning to the masses gathered in the mud of the town square. Tonight, we peel back the skin of history to reveal the machinery of human cruelty. From the slow stretch of the tendons to the searing heat of the metal, these are the most horrific punishments ever devised in medieval Europe. Close your eyes if you dare, because once you hear the screams of the past, they never truly fade. The rack was not merely a tool of interrogation, it was a profound testament to the medieval obsession with the physical limits of the human soul and the terrifying precision of mechanical engineering. To look upon it was to see a skeletal frame of heavy oak and iron rollers, an architecture designed for the sole purpose of expanding the human body beyond its biological constraints. This device transformed the act of questioning into a slow-motion symphony of structural failure, where every inch gained by the executioner was a mile of agony for the condemned. It sat in the lightless bellies of castles, a silent predator waiting for those who dared to defy the crown or the church. Within these chambers, the air was thick with the scent of damp stone and the metallic tang of fear, setting the stage for a ritual that would leave victims permanently unmade. When the victim was led to the device, the process began with a chilling, clinical preparation that stripped away all remnants of human dignity and replaced them with cold utility. The wrists and ankles were tightly cinched into leather manacles, which were in turn connected to thick hempen ropes wound around heavy cylinders at either end of the frame. There was a deceptive stillness in these first moments, a quiet before the storm where the prisoner could feel the weight of the machine against their skin. The executioner would then take his place at the winding handle, waiting for the signal to begin the mechanical translation of a man into a map of pain. This initial tension was enough to make the heart hammer against the ribs, as the victim realized their very anatomy was now a slave to the turning of a wooden wheel. As the first turn of the crank echoed through the dungeon, the slack in the ropes vanished, and the true horror of the rack began to manifest in a series of sickening rhythmic sounds. The silence would be broken by the groan of the wood under stress, soon followed by the more intimate sounds of the human body protesting its forced elongation. Muscles would first stretch to their absolute limits, burning with a fire that felt as though molten lead was being poured through the veins. Then came the pops and cracks, the sound of ligaments fraying like old rope and tendons, snapping under the relentless mechanical pull of the rollers. Each rotation of the handle was a deliberate choice by the interrogator, a measured increment of suffering designed to break the will long before the body finally gave way. The agony eventually reached a crescendo where the skeleton itself began to betray the flesh as the joints were systematically forced from their sockets in a display of structural collapse. Shoulders would slide out of place with a dull thud, followed by the hips and knees, leaving the victim's limbs elongated and uselessly limp against the wooden slats. The chest cavity would flatten and expand unnaturally, making every shallow breath an excruciating labor as the ribs were pulled outward away from the spine. In this state, the prisoner became a distorted shadow of a human being, a collection of broken hinges and torn fibers that could no longer support the weight of a life. It was a masterpiece of the slow death, where the victim was kept on the precipice of consciousness to ensure that every vibration of the machine was felt in full. Even if the victim survived the interrogation and was eventually released from the rack, they were often left as a permanent living monument to the terrifying power of medieval justice. The damage was rarely just skin deep. The internal ruin meant that many would never walk again, their limbs hanging at odd angles as a result of permanent dislocation and nerve destruction. They would carry the memory of the rack in every step, a constant ache in the marrow of their bones that served as a silent warning to anyone who looked upon them. This was the ultimate goal of the device, to not only extract a confession, but to rewrite the victim's physical existence into a story of absolute submission. The rack remains a dark pinnacle of human ingenuity, proving that when men turn their minds to cruelty, they can turn a simple frame of wood into a gateway to hell. The Iron Maiden stands as the most iconic and terrifying sentinel of the medieval torture chamber, a vertical sarcophagus crafted to mock the human form while systematically destroying it. This hollow effigy, often fashioned with the stoic face of a woman, was a masterpiece of psychological warfare designed to freeze the blood of any prisoner who looked upon its metallic visage. It was not a weapon of quick death, but a vessel for a prolonged, claustrophobic nightmare where the boundary between a tomb and an instrument of justice was entirely erased. Inside its heavy iron doors lay a dark void that promised a singular, inescapable embrace from which no man or woman ever emerged unchanged or whole. To enter the Iron Maiden was to step out of the world of the living and into a personalized iron hell that turned the very air into a suffocating shroud. The true horror of this machine lay in its internal architecture, which featured a series of long, razor-sharp iron spikes strategically positioned to pierce the body without delivering a killing blow. These spikes were meticulously aligned by cruel craftsmen to target non-vital areas such as the eyes, the arms, the chest, and the soft flesh of the abdomen to ensure maximum suffering. As the heavy doors were slowly pushed shut by the executioner, the victim would feel the cold tips of the metal pressing against their skin, a frantic warning of the agony to follow. There was no room to move or recoil within the cramped confines of the iron shell, forcing the condemned to stand perfectly still as their own weight pushed them onto the blades. The design ensured that the victim would remain upright and conscious, pinned by the very spikes that were draining their life force in a slow, rhythmic crawl. Once the doors were fully latched, the interior of the Maiden became a tomb of absolute darkness, where the only sounds were the victim's own ragged gasps and the steady drip of blood. Because the spikes were thick enough to plug the very wounds they created, the process of bleeding out was agonizingly slow, often lasting for several hours or even days of silent torment. The victim remained impaled in a standing position, unable to collapse or shift their weight, as the iron thorns held them in a rigid vertical crucifixion of the state's design. This forced posture caused the muscles to cramp and the lungs to labor, turning every moment into a desperate struggle for a breath that was flavored with the scent of iron. It was a sterile and lonely death, hidden away from the world behind a decorative metal face that remained indifferent to the screams echoing within. The psychological toll of the Iron Maiden was perhaps even more devastating than the physical mutilation, as it utilized the primal human fears of darkness, confinement, and impending impalement. The prisoner was forced to watch their own slow-motion execution as the spikes drew closer with every inch the door moved, knowing exactly where the metal would first breach their vulnerable, trembling flesh. There was a perverse intimacy to the device, as it wrapped around the body like a lover's embrace, yet offered only the cold, unyielding bite of serrated iron and the finality of a locked door. This anticipation of pain shattered the victim's mind long before the first spike drew blood, turning the final moments of their life into a frantic, internal scramble for a mercy that was never coming. The Maiden did not just break bones or tear skin, it consumed the victim's sanity, leaving them to rot in a dark, upright coffin while the world continued outside. When the doors were finally opened, the body that fell out was a gruesome testament to the ingenuity of medieval cruelty, riddled with holes and drained of its vital essence. These devices were often placed in prominent areas of the dungeon or public squares to serve as a silent metal warning to all who might consider defying the established social or religious order. The Iron Maiden was a symbol of absolute power, a way for the ruling class to demonstrate that they could control even the most private spaces of a person's physical existence. Though historians debate the frequency of its actual use, its presence in the cultural memory of Europe remains a haunting reminder of a time when justice was measured in blood. It stands today as a chilling relic of a dark age, a cold iron ghost that continues to whisper the terrifying possibilities of what happens when humanity loses its capacity for mercy. The breaking wheel, often referred to as the Catherine wheel, was a spectacle of public destruction that transformed a common agricultural tool into a platform for utter human ruin. To the medieval peasant, the wheel was a symbol of life and labor, but in the hands of the high executioner, it became a terrifying engine of slow, calculated, anatomical disintegration. The condemned was brought before a baying crowd and tied securely to the massive wooden spokes, their limbs stretched out like the very silk they might have once traded. This was not a punishment designed for the shadows of a dungeon, but a theatrical display of the state's absolute power over the physical frame. Every spectator was forced to witness the fragility of the human body when matched against the cold, unyielding weight of iron-rimmed oak and a heavy executioner's hammer. The air would grow thick with anticipation, the silence only broken by the heavy footsteps of the man tasked with shattering the life before him. The procedure began with a series of rhythmic, heavy strikes that were intended to systematically pulverize the large bones of the arms and legs without causing immediate death. The executioner would wield a heavy iron-reinforced club or a smaller weighted wheel, bringing it down with practiced precision upon the thighs, shins, and forearms of the victim. With each impact, the sickening sound of snapping bone would ripple through the square, a wet and hollow crunch that signaled the end of the victim's mobility forever. The goal was to turn the sturdy pillars of the human skeleton into a collection of jagged shards and useless pulp, held together only by the surrounding muscle. As the limbs were shattered, the victim would often drift into a state of shock, their screams becoming guttural and raw as the reality of their mangled state set in. There was no mercy in these strikes. They were a methodical erasure of the body's structural integrity, performed with the cold detachment of a smith at an anvil. Once the bones were sufficiently broken, the punishment entered its most grotesque phase, where the victim's mangled limbs were literally woven through the gaps between the wooden spokes. Because the bones were now nothing more than splintered fragments, the executioner could bend the arms and legs at impossible, unnatural angles that defied the very laws of human anatomy. The prisoner was transformed into a human knot, their broken body contorted into a circular display of agony that mirrored the shape of the wheel itself. This process was excruciatingly slow, as the executioner had to ensure the victim remained alive and conscious through the entire ordeal of being threaded like twine. This reconfiguration of the body was designed to strip away the last vestiges of human form, leaving behind a breathing wreck that no longer resembled a man. The sight of a person woven into a wheel was a haunting image that stayed with the witnesses long after the execution was over. The wheel was then hoisted into the air on a tall wooden pole, leaving the victim suspended between the earth and the sky for the entire world to see. In this elevated position, the prisoner was left to the mercy of the elements, the scorching sun and the scavenging birds that would soon descend upon the helpless. Exposed and broken, the victim might linger for hours or even several days, their heartbeat a stubborn flicker in a body that had already been largely destroyed. Thirst and exhaustion would set in, but the pain of the shattered marrow was a constant, screaming companion that prevented even the slightest moment of relief or unconsciousness. Passers-by would look up at the wheelbird, a twisted silhouette against the clouds, serving as a permanent and terrifying reminder of the cost of defying the law. This was the true cruelty of the wheel, not just the breaking of the bone, but the abandonment of the broken soul to a slow and lonely end. The legacy of the breaking wheel remains one of the darkest chapters in the history of capital punishment, representing a time when justice was a form of high-intensity performance art. It was a punishment that sought to deny the victim even the dignity of a recognizable corpse, turning them instead into a mangled warning for the masses to contemplate. The psychological impact on the community was profound, as the wheel stayed in place long after the victim had finally succumbed to their wounds and the elements. Eventually, only a bleached skeleton woven through the wood would remain, a grim harvest of a justice system that valued terror far above the concept of human rights. To study the wheel is to look into a mirror of human history and see the capacity for a cruelty that is both imaginative and devastatingly efficient. It stands as a reminder of a world where the wheel of fortune could turn at any moment, crushing the weak beneath its heavy and unforgiving weight. The brazen bull remains perhaps the most poetic and perverse instrument of death ever conceived, a hollow bronze statue that turned the act of execution into a musical performance. Crafted in the likeness of a powerful ox, this device was not designed for the dark seclusion of a dungeon, but for the open air of the city square. Its belly served as a furnace and its mouth as a megaphone, creating a terrifying synthesis of art and absolute, unmitigated human suffering. To the medieval mind, it represented the ultimate triumph of human craftsmanship used for the most diabolical and heartless of purposes. The prisoner would be forced through a small, hidden hatch in the side of the beast, sealed forever away from the light of the sun. Once the door was bolted, the victim was left in a cramped metallic void, waiting for the first tendrils of heat to rise from the bronze floor. As the fire was stoked beneath the belly of the bull, the interior would slowly transform into a searing oven of radiant, golden-hued death. The bronze walls would first begin to glow with a dull heat, then a cherry-red intensity that turned the air inside into a lung-scorching vapor. The victim would scramble against the smooth, curved interior, searching for a cool surface that simply did not exist within the burning heart of the statue. Their skin would blister and peel upon contact with the metal, creating a frantic, desperate dance of survival that only accelerated their physical and mental exhaustion. There was no escape from the heat, which permeated every inch of the hollow space, ensuring that the agony was constant and all-encompassing. The metal became a predator, slowly consuming the living flesh of the prisoner until they were nothing more than a mass of charred and smoking remains. The most horrific feature of the brazen bull was its complex internal plumbing, a series of curved pipes and reeds designed to transform screams into sound. As the victim gasped for air and shrieked in unendurable pain, their vocalizations were funneled through the bull's throat and out through its nostrils. This mechanical conversion stripped the humanity from the cry, turning the frantic wail of a dying man into the deep, melodic bellowing of a rampaging beast. To the onlookers standing in the square, the execution did not sound like a murder, but like the majestic roar of a mythical creature come to life. This auditory trickery was intended to distance the crowd from the victim's humanity, making the spectacle of death feel like a piece of dark, grand theater. It was a masterpiece of psychological insulation, allowing the observers to enjoy the music of the bull while ignoring the reality of the roasting flesh inside. The smell that drifted from the nostrils of the bull was often masked by incense, yet the psychological weight of the smoke was unmistakable to those who knew its source. As the fire reached its peak, the prisoner would eventually succumb to either the intense heat or the lack of oxygen, their final moments spent in a delirious haze. The brazen bull offered no visual confirmation of death, leaving the crowd to rely entirely on the silence that followed the last mechanical bellow of the beast. This lingering uncertainty added a layer of profound dread to the punishment, as the metal statue stood silent and hot long after the life within had been snuffed out. It was a sterile, enclosed execution that left no blood on the ground, only a scorched and empty shell that seemed to possess a life of its own. The bull sat as a silent witness to the capacity for human cruelty to disguise itself as high-minded innovation and aesthetic beauty. When the statue was finally allowed to cool, the hatch would be opened to reveal the calcified, ash-white bones of the condemned, often shimmering with a strange, pearly luster. These remains were sometimes gathered and turned into jewelry or charms, a final indignity that treated the victim's body as a byproduct of a successful industrial process. The brazen bull serves as a haunting reminder of a time when the boundary between a creative invention and a weapon of mass psychological trauma was virtually non-existent. It stands in history as a symbol of the dark side of the human imagination, where the beauty of form was used to amplify the horror of the function. To contemplate the bull is to understand that the most terrifying monsters are not those found in legends, but those forged by human hands in the fires of vengeance. It remains a cold, metallic ghost of a past where the sound of music was once the sound of a human soul being burned away. Scaphism, often referred to as the boats, remains one of the most stomach-churning and protracted methods of execution ever whispered about in the annals of ancient and medieval history. This was not a punishment of blades or fire, but a calculated abandonment to the most repulsive processes of the natural world, turning a person's own biology against them. The condemned was stripped naked and placed inside a narrow, shallow boat, while another identical vessel was placed over the top, sandwiching them in a wooden shell. Only the head, hands, and feet were allowed to protrude through specifically carved notches, leaving the victim's torso trapped in a dark, stagnant, and increasingly humid microenvironment. To the outside observer, it looked like a strange floating coffin, but for the one inside, it was the beginning of a descent into a living rot. The boats were then pushed out onto a still pond or a marshy swamp where the heat of the sun would begin to bake the wooden exterior. The true mechanism of this horror began with a perverse and forced overindulgence, as the victim was systematically fed a mixture of milk and honey to the point of physical illness. If the prisoner refused to eat, the executioners would use needles to prick their eyes or other sensitive areas until the pain forced them to swallow the cloying, sweet liquid. This rich diet was designed to trigger a severe and uncontrollable bout of watery diarrhea, which would quickly fill the lower boat and coat the victim's lower half in a thick layer of excrement. The honey was also smeared liberally over the exposed parts of the body, particularly the eyes, ears, and groin, to serve as a beacon for the local insect population. In the humid air of the marsh, the scent of the sweetness and the stench of the waste created a lethal chemical trail that could be detected for miles. Within hours, the first buzzing scouts would arrive, signaling the start of a biological invasion that the victim was powerless to repel or even swat away. As the days stretched into weeks, the boats became a thriving, buzzing ecosystem of decay where the victim was both the host and the feast for thousands of ravenous creatures. Swarms of flies, wasps, and beetles would descend upon the honeyed flesh, biting and stinging the face and limbs until the skin was a mass of weeping, infected sores. More horrific still was the fate of the lower body, as the stagnant filth inside the boat began to attract maggots and aquatic insects that did not merely bite the surface. These creatures would burrow deep into the softened, waterlogged skin, entering the body through the bowels and laying eggs within the living tissue of the victim's internal organs. The prisoner was kept alive by daily forced feedings, ensuring that the process of being eaten from the inside out was prolonged for as long as humanly possible. It was a state of existence where the boundaries between the living body and the rotting environment were entirely dissolved in a sickening, buzzing haze of agony. The psychological devastation of scaphism was a slow-motion collapse into madness as the victim lay paralyzed in the dark, feeling every movement of the parasites beneath their skin. The constant high-pitched hum of the insects and the searing pain of 1,000 tiny mandibles created a sensory overload that shattered the mind long before the heart finally failed. There was no reprieve from the sun during the day, which burned the exposed skin, nor from the damp, biting cold of the marsh at night, which stiffened the mangled joints. The isolation was absolute, broken only by the daily arrival of the executioners who came not to offer mercy, but to force-feed the victim more milk and honey to keep the cycle going. It was a punishment that mocked the concept of a clean death, replacing it with a lingering, nauseating intimacy with the most grotesque aspects of nature's recycling process. The victim became a prisoner of their own failing anatomy, watching and feeling as their body turned into a literal nest for the very creatures that were killing them. Death usually came after 17 to 20 days of this relentless biological siege, often resulting from a combination of septic shock, dehydration, and total organ failure. When the upper boat was finally removed, the sight that met the executioners was a scene of such profound horror that it challenged the limits of human description. The victim's lower half would often be entirely hollowed out, replaced by a churning mass of worms and insects that had consumed the flesh while the brain was still conscious. This was the ultimate victory of the state over the individual, a death that was so repulsive and slow that it erased the humanity of the victim before they had even stopped breathing. Scaphism remains a chilling reminder of a time when the human imagination was used to weaponize the natural world, turning the simple boat into a vessel of unimaginable cruelty. It stands as a dark monument to the capacity for vengeance to override every instinct of human compassion, leaving behind only a story of rot and silence on a stagnant pond. In the realm of English common law, the sentence for high treason was designed to be the ultimate choreographed nightmare, known as being hanged, drawn, and quartered. This was not merely an execution, but a meticulously paced, theatrical performance of the king's absolute power over the physical and political body of the condemned. The ritual began with the prisoner being tied to a wooden hurdle and dragged by a horse through the filthy cobblestone streets toward the place of execution. This drawing was intended to strip the victim of their dignity, leaving them battered and covered in the waste of the city before they even reached the gallows. The crowds would jeer and throw stones, participating in a collective social purging that prepared the victim for the gruesome mechanical stages of their final hours. It was a journey into the heart of a public darkness where the law functioned as a butcher of the soul. The second act of this tragedy took place beneath the shadow of the noose, where the prisoner was subjected to a short drop hanging. Unlike the swift snap of a modern execution, this was a slow and agonizing strangulation, intended to bring the victim to the very brink of death without allowing them to cross over. Just as the darkness began to close in and the face turned a deep, bruised purple, the executioner would cut the rope, letting the body thud onto the platform. The victim was shocked back into consciousness, gasping for air only to find themselves staring into the eyes of the man who would now disassemble them while they lived. This transition from the air to the blade was the most terrifying moment of the entire ritual, a brief and frantic realization that the worst was yet to come. The state required the victim to be fully awake to witness the systematic destruction of their own physical humanity. The drawing then entered its most literal and visceral phase, as the executioner's knife was used to open the living belly of the condemned man. While the prisoner watched in a state of traumatic shock, his bowels and internal organs were carefully removed and displayed to the baying, frenzied crowd. These entrails were then cast into a nearby brazier where they were consumed by flames, sending the scent of the victim's own burning flesh into his final shallow breaths. This was the ultimate symbolic act of treasonous erasure, demonstrating that even the most private and internal parts of a person belonged to the crown they had betrayed. It was a violation of the most fundamental biological sanctuary, turning the human anatomy into a public map of failed rebellion and graphic smoldering ruin. The victim's heart was often saved for the very last, ripped from the chest to signal the official end of the life. Once life had finally fled the mangled remains, the executioner would take a heavy cleaver to perform the final, structural act of the sentence, the quartering. The headless torso was hacked into 4 distinct sections, a brutal labor that required the strength of a butcher and the coldness of a stone. These quarters were not buried, but were instead sent to the 4 corners of the kingdom, where they were displayed on city gates and bridges to rot in the open air. This ensured that the punishment was not confined to a single day or a single square, but was a persistent, geographic warning to every citizen. The sight of a decaying limb hanging from a spiked gate served as a silent, skeletal sermon on the consequences of defying the sovereign's will. It turned the very landscape of the country into a gallery of horrors, where the geography of the land matched the geography of the king's vengeance. Today, the memory of being hanged, drawn, and quartered stands as a chilling testament to a time when justice was measured in the duration and visibility of a person's agony. It was a punishment that sought to deny the victim even the peace of a whole grave, scattering their identity across the wind and the fire. This ritualized cruelty was the state's way of proving that it could not only take a life, but could entirely deconstruct the meaning of a human being. It remains a dark pinnacle of Western legal history, a reminder of the terrifying heights of imagination that humans reach when they seek to codify their hatred into law. To look back at these scaffolds is to see the raw, unvarnished power of a past that believed the only way to ensure order was through the total, graphic destruction of the flesh. The echoes of these executions still linger in the cold stones of London, a haunting legacy of a crown that ruled through the blade.